So I got a message from first of all Elisabeth and then from Jacques about interacting with this interesting group that you're doing and the kind of things you're thinking about. These were the questions that were asked of me by Jacques, and I think I can answer them in a certain way. I have a fair amount of knowledge about it, but I thought I would take a broader look at what I call three pathways in which universities are socially engaged, civically engaged, or different words from this. I will admit to you, I'm not a big fan of the third mission way of branding it, because to me, it makes it sound like it's an extra thing they put on at the end, as opposed to saying it's an integral part of what you do as a public university in specific. I mean, we have private universities in the United States that have some elements of that public mission, but nothing like the big publics, nothing. I can make that argument pretty easily, I think. But so I have these three areas I'm going to talk about very briefly. Public purpose and mission, what are some of the programmatic practices and external relations, and then I'll provide some anecdotal things related to the University of California as part of my charge. And I want to say that, I think one thing I've really focused on in some of my research is what's the real difference between this broad understanding of what the public university should do, like USP or like Berkeley, and then how does it actually integrate into actual practices of the institution? And I don't mean just programs. I mean, well, I'll get back to this, but I think this is a really key component, is how does it fit into faculty hiring and advancement practices? If it doesn't, then you really got a big problem, because the faculty who are key to this are not the only ones, but are key, are just not going to integrate into the mission of the institution. And I think a lot of universities have a kind of a disconnect between the broader concept of what they're supposed to be doing, sometimes in mission statements, in charters, and then what they're actually practicing and how they behave. So the other aspect of this is, of course, that you need to integrate programmatic practices with the public purpose of the institution. But I also want to emphasize that you need to have an infrastructure of institutional research capacity in order to gauge and understand what's going on in the university, both from the viewpoint of improving internal management of the institution and providing evidence to the outside world of your overall practices and impact. So I just wanted to say that, of course, in talking about these issues, what hangs over all of us is COVID and its full impact on the university and its changing behaviors of activity of universities, everything from teaching to research. I am familiar, at least I learned more about how important the universities are in Sao Paulo in relationship to reacting to COVID, and that's providing, I think, at least a sense of greater worth of the university within the public, which is fantastic, and that's an important kind of thing. But COVID hangs all over this, although I'm not talking a lot about it. I'm hoping that we're going to come back to a world in which we have a semi-new normal, shall we say. So then, so here are some of my listings of kind of general purpose. I'm just not going to mention all of them, but I just wanted to kind of say, we get these mission statements, but they're very limited often. They say very kind of specific things in charters, but they're not really elaborate explanations of what we think we're doing as public institutions. Here's a listing that I generally think are important parts of what public universities are supposed to be doing, and have usually historically in some way been doing, but maybe sometimes not developed as well as they could be or thought out in a coherent way for the university as a whole. Again, structures of institutions differ greatly. How much power is it as at the faculty level, how much is in the departmental level, how much ability it's steering the institution do rectors have in Sao Paulo or in the state of Sao Paulo? There's, where you elect rectors and they usually have short terms. There are a lot of dynamics for that. But what I want to say, though, is promoting regional and socioeconomic mobility. I think all of us think that's an important aspect of what we do. We act as talent magnets. And this is not listed in priority at all. It's just a listing. Developing educated and engaged students. I think we all think that's important. Meeting local regional labor needs. Extending educational programs to underserved populations, everything from adult learning, lifelong learning to other kinds of relationships, promoting local economic development and innovation, pursuing research that provides services that promote the health and welfare of society. And I will come back to that one in a different way. Then continuing the list, public service activities of faculty, promoting civic knowledge, culture and arts. Again, universities usually have libraries and museums and performing arts facilities and science centers or various other things to integrate with the larger public that are important to what we do. Preserving and interpreting local regional history, which relates to that. Preserving and managing local, regional, historical, and important environmental sites. At least some institutions do that. The University of California has a gigantic, vast regional natural reserve system that we manage for research, but also for environmental protection purposes. So these are just a kind of a long listing of things that you might not see directly in a mission statement, but I think we know are generally, not everything perhaps, is something that our universities do. And then the question is, well, how do they, fit into the programmatic aspect of what we're doing, as opposed to what we think we want done? So then I'm just keeping on this public purpose mission governance part to get to the University of California very briefly. The governance side of University of California is something I know of interest. And so, it dates back to 1868, and there's a charter and through legislation that really does, in the American way of thinking of things, say how important both teaching, research, and a concept in the mid-1800s of public service. It's built into the charter of the institution. This is part of this land grant initiative in which funding was provided through land by the federal government, and states created Berkeley, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, these major institutions. And right there, it says up there, economic and regional development is a component of what these institutions are supposed to do. So it's been in the DNA of these institutions for a very long time. Then they've evolved. What does it mean? These kinds of things. Usually it was huge efforts at agricultural development. The University of California is gigantically important for agricultural development in California, which was the major industry of the 1920s for California. So how is it organized? Well, the University of California has a board. The board has 24 members. A high percentage of them are appointed by governors. They serve 12-year terms, so they're supposed to be staggered, so not one governor controls that board. But also on the board is a faculty representative, a representative of the alumni, a number of ex officio members, including the governor. So it has this kind of quasi-public elected official constituency component to it, but the concept is it's not made up of faculty, it doesn't include staff, and it doesn't include students. In our structure, you have a much more Euro approach to these kinds of boards, but these boards often don't, in the other examples, often don't have as much power, but it varies. But this is supposed to be a board that will then both link the university to the public needs and constituencies, including the business community, but also act as a buffer against political winds of blaming universities or other kinds of things. But empowering that for the University of California is a very unusual level of autonomy that it was granted in 1879 for various reasons that made the university a public trust, almost like a fourth branch of government, in which, of course, the board has integrated with the public in various ways and elected officials, but actually under law, the legislature can pass no legislation that will affect academic programs or management of the university internally. I mean, in theory, there's lots of things that go on. And the only responsibility directly to the legislature is fiduciary, the budgetary aspects. So there's structures related to how you spend money and all of that. But that autonomy made a huge difference for the University of California in how it evolved. It made it so the University of California, one, was protected, but also had to kind of develop its own internal mechanisms of management. And that had been done over time. And then another element that relates to this is that the University of California at a critical point realized that it needed to expand geographically, and UCLA was the next campus in 1919, and it made a decision to grow geographically with the state's population as it grew. And the net result was a one university model. This model basically said, there is one president for the University of California, there is one board, and the campuses have chancellors and have various responsibilities, but they need to structure and manage themselves within that. And then related to that is this concept of shared governance. And again, the University of California is one of the models, or I don't know if you say model, but it is one of the examples of the most powerful faculty, at least in the United States, related to the management of the institution, because they have very designated areas of authority, including admissions, setting the standard for admissions for the entire system, determining the curriculum, and sharing in hiring and advancement of faculty. I mean, they really run it, but because it's a budgetary decision as well, it's a shared responsibility between the administration and the Senate. So this structure is familiar, I'm sure, but it has a very long history in the University of California. Many people look at the shared governance structure and the University One model as one of the reasons that the University of California is one of the greatest public universities in the world, whether it's Berkeley or UCLA individually or as a system. So these are just some of the areas in which there's a shared responsibility. But one thing that's very important too, I think, for the Sao Paulo, looking at Sao Paulo, is that when the University of California goes to get money from the state of California, which is still the largest provider of funding, single provider within reason, the federal government's getting close on research, but there's only one request for the entire system. And it has a kind of an equity structure around budgeting related to it. So you don't have the chancellor at UCLA or the chancellor at Berkeley going in with their hand out at Berkeley, in Sacramento. There's a structure around that, and that creates a lot of power, political power in negotiating, of course, in alignment also with the alumni. So programmatic practices. Now I'm going to shift towards what are some of the things that are the relationship between this broader concept of what our institutions are doing, or at least maybe we could create a shared understanding of it, because it's not going to be in any single document that I've ever seen. But kind of going from very basic behavioral patterns to more significant ones, relations with schools. Universities have, in California, for example, have a very strong relationship with curriculum development in high schools and down into K through 12, and have relationships with those schools, providing support services, other kinds of things through their schools of ed or other forums. Also, a lot of volunteer work by students at our campuses, at local schools. Admissions criteria. This is a really important area too, which is very different than most of the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the world has a single test, a national test, and there's reasons for that. And that's the main entry point. I think if I remember correctly, the campuses as USP and UNICAMP and perhaps others have an additional criteria that relate to maybe an exam in physics or these kinds of things, but it's very test oriented. So in the University of California has had for a long time, and it reflects an American model, a more holistic approach. Yes, there's test scores, there's curriculum that you take in high school, but there are other things that might determine your competitiveness to get into, say, Berkeley. And civic engagement is a very big component of that. It's really hard, in fact, to get into Berkeley without some component in your high school career of some form of civic engagement or being involved in, say, a student organization, or it could be broadly defined. But the thing I want to point to this, by setting that admissions criteria, it sets a standard for when students come to Berkeley or within the UC system. Behaviorally, these students are already used to being engaged in some form. And so we have very high rates of volunteer work or structural approaches to providing service learning courses, they're called, which students can get credit or other forms of support and mentoring from faculty to be involved in the community in some form. But I just wanted to say that admissions criteria isn't just about the entrance gate, it's about the relationship with the schools and the general population and how you're drawing students from underrepresented groups. Now, the other point, and then I'll really want to point to, is how important hiring and promotion practices are in integrating public service and other activities, mentorships that faculty do. Unfortunately, in much of the world, the global ranking structure and citation analysis has become the bread and butter, the dominant factor in advancement and hiring as well. And this has really had, there's some positives, but it's mostly negatives, I would say. And it's drawn faculty away from larger public. They don't see, like, if I know many systems, if they get engaged in local communities and say they're giving expert opinions or work for local community transportation, you know, to other things, they don't get any credit for that. They just do it because they want to do it, which a lot of faculty do, but it's not integrated into how they're reviewed in terms of their advancement. So this is, I wrote an article, this is some in a book, but also an article at University World News that outlined this more in specific and what kind of criteria should they really be thinking about. Now that's a sea change for many institutions because, you know, they basically tell faculty, A, you've got to, you know, get so many citations and you've got to get advance, you know, take X amount of courses. And that's about all they tell them for advancement. That's a gross exaggeration perhaps, but it's close. So the other thing I want to note on this list is tech transfer infrastructure. That's obviously an area that we see a lot of important and entrepreneurial support programs for faculty and students that support the effort to get patents, license, or expertise in startups and these kinds of things. Undergraduate curriculum, that's a really important component. Organization and practice of public service activities of faculty. So in other words, there's an infrastructure there to help, sometimes are run by universities, to get volunteer work, get students to volunteer in various organizations. Sometimes it's student run as well, and they'll get some funding from the university as well. Then extension, adult learning, that's another very important component of that relationship, larger relationship with the society. So I want to make sure, because I know the time, I've been going here for a while, I'm almost near the end. So the other component pathway relates to these external relations, and I put institutional research in there because I think it's hard to have really coherent external relations, that is with your constituents. What, you know, you can name them. They can be the general public, they can be lawmakers, they can be business people. You know, you've got a set of constituents that you can outline, and how are you relating to each of them. Of course, they integrate in some form, but you really need to have an institutional research capacity in order to systematically collect data on the kinds of variables, the things that you think are important, and then how effective are you. You can never be, you know, you can't do a full analysis of how effective, but you can have data that can tell you these things, and you can provide that to the public. I guess this will be a topic of one of our speakers later on. But I would also say that there's a real neglect in institutional research by most institutions, or their learning curve is now going, but to understand how important it is to systematically collect data and have analysis that can support strategic planning, evidence-based management. I don't mean to get too naming these kinds of things, but and that's really an important component, but it's also important for trying to make the larger public understand what you're doing. Of course, alumni, constituencies, how well you integrate, and there are different historical relationships with alumni. That's harder to raise money from alumni, but it's not just about that. It's also about networking so that alumni can get jobs, these kinds of things. This is a very important broad area. I should have mentioned lobbying is also how organized are you around public relations and government relations. The University of California, for example, has an office in Sacramento that represents the entire system. They track all legislation. They create personal relationships with lawmakers. They use faculty and students in that cause. They do look at regional, like, you know, Berkeley is in one district and Los Angeles is in another. Then you've got the same modeling going on at the state, at the federal level, because in the United States, you know, research funding, financial aid comes largely on research, comes from the federal government, a little bit like FFLCH, I think. But so that's, you know, those kinds of structures are very important, but you need this other infrastructure to help you. Now, getting the final thing is to say, well, what's an example of data gathering that is useful in talking to the larger public and lawmakers? So the University of California has developed over the last decade plus something called an accountability report. I'm sure a lot of institutions have them. This one's online, and it's the most extensive I've ever seen by an institution. And this is just one example. Here's data of doctoral students and where they were employed from the data. There's some problems with data collection on employment, but it generally, I think, is fairly accurate, showing where students are getting, doctoral students are getting employed. So there's a very extensive listing on this report, and I'd be glad to forward the URL for you. And you'll see how the accountability report reflects what the university thinks it's doing in terms of a public benefit. And it's a way of organizing that, and all the data, and a significant amount of data, is downloadable. So this chart has an Excel file. So it's a part of transparency that is very powerful. Often lawmakers or their staff will go, well, what about this or this? And instead of like generating a specific report, oh, that can't happen, they can go, well, look, it's all online. We're providing all this data so you can see what's happening to our alumni. Here's another example of looking at 5-year retention rates. And the data also, interestingly, does often show the different campuses. And, that whole thing about, oh my gosh, we're so worried, will LA look better than Merced, or that was a scare, was worrisome to many of the campuses early on in the development, but eventually they realized, this is part of our transparency. So this is simply showing retention rates and showing the differences with some other data from other institutions. So with that, I just want to say my final statement. I won't read the entire thing, let you look at it for a minute. But the last part I want to say is, to borrow from the Humboldtian model, which I think we all adhere to a certain degree, it's teaching and learning, research, and public service as integrated activities, not as a third thing we just added on. And I'm not trying to say that every faculty member and every student should be engaged in some massive amount of civic engagement as I've defined it before, but that it's integrated as part of a cultural aspect, and it's rewarded, and there's funding for it, and there's support for it, and it's understood as a major component of what we do as institutions. So with that, I want to thank you for listening.
I think that John made 3 points that are very important. First of all, we need to acknowledge, we need to value the social engagement of our students, our academics, and everyone else, and our employees, or our people. The other thing is this dynamic, this communication dynamic, which is so central, but I think that Professor Nina Ranieri are going to address this with much more detail. So I'm not going to talk about it. And the other thing is this design of the governance, which I am afraid that the university by themselves are not, well, strong enough to change this design. But this is a problem for us, because if we don't have this space for negotiation, our role with the external stakeholders, it means that we are going to be forever in this situation that we feel encircled with the other forces. We are going every time to feel being attacked by people, by the forces from outside the society. And do you think that it's possible for a university to really have a dialogue, not a monologue, with the society without this kind of channel linking society, really representatives of the society, with the internal life of the university? Because I think that this is something that is missing in our, let's say, institutional design of our universities. The other thing is that because we have this quite internal system of electing our high authorities, it means that, to a certain degree, this dynamic shut down the voice of the society relating to our business. So these are the two more, I think that John made 3 points that are very important. First of all, we need to acknowledge, we need to value the social engagement of our students, our academics, and everyone else, and our employees, or our people. The other thing is this dynamic, this communication dynamic, which is so central, but I think that Professor Nina Ranieri are going to address this with much more detail. So I'm not going to talk about it. And the other thing is this design of the governance, which I am afraid that the university by themselves are not, well, strong enough to change this design. But this is a problem for us, because if we don't have this space for negotiation, our role with the external stakeholders, it means that we are going to be forever in this situation that we feel encircled with the other forces. We are going every time to feel being attacked by people, by the forces from outside the society and things like that.
Let's see, on how would you look at how to engage publicly? I think that was your question. I would say look at constituents. I think that's what Nina was doing as well. She was looking at least partially about government officials. What is it that you're doing in order to communicate with them? And on that regard, there's different groups in which you're trying to communicate with. And I think, in terms of trying to prove the usefulness of the institution, one, you have to have a more coherent understanding what that is, and collect information and analysis, such as a report, as she says, that can be given to government officials and discussed with at hearings or these kinds of things. And that there could be other things at that top level. That can be made in agreements with local city governments to have a program of volunteer students or these kinds of things. That's the kind of a top-down approach, which should be an approach. But the other part to note is that some of your best emissaries are students, faculty, and alumni. And then the question is, well, how can you engage them to go and meet with constituents, and not just, one targeted group that will make decisions, but it's a long haul. You're talking about a long program of trying to have greater interaction with society in general. And your students and your faculty and alumni, the way that you can do faculty and students is provide incentives, provide support structures to help them do it, show that it's a value of some sort. So that's what I would say is you're going to look at constituencies and think about how you interact with each of them. The other question was about the power of the rector to lead. And this is not a problem unique to Brazil. This is all, a structural approach outside of the Asia world of China and others. But the ability of the rector who is elected, as opposed to in the United States, it's an appointment by the board. This is one of the powers of the board. And there's pluses and minuses to this, absolutely. The president serves at the pleasure of the board until he or she is, retires or is let go. And right now, the average of a presidency at a major university is like 6 years now, I think, or something like that. There's a few exceptions, but as opposed to a structure in which you have an election, there's term limits. The rector needs to, really play to the ear of the faculty and the students and the staff. Again, that's not all bad, but it creates a different kind of power structure as to what the rector really can do to manage the institution, especially when they're so decentralized. And this kind of question too is similar in Japan, where the faculty and the departments are so powerful that even collecting campus-wide data is difficult because you got to get everybody to agree to it. So I don't have a magic answer to that, except for I think there needs to be a greater balance and authority given to the rector's office. And so how does that usually play out? Well, again, I could be speaking out of turn here, but the ability of the rector to appoint the deans, yes, in consultation with the faculty, these kinds of appointment structures are very important. And then there's the power of the purse, of finances as well. So there's this is a topic of a lot of research and investigation. I think the question is, it's not the movement towards a US model, for example, which is very much of a CEO kind of structure to some degree, although I noted to you, there's very distinct powers of the faculty that are codified. They're codified. You know what they are. There's grayness to it, but there's a lot of very central areas of control. So there's understanding of the roles and responsibilities. But you're not going to replicate that in the culture and the governance structure in Brazil, but you need some movement, I think, in order to make the institution be able to strategically plan and put resources. At least that's my opinion from an outsider's viewpoint, but I will admit that my knowledge level is not good enough. Although I did see Marcelo Noble, I was there the day he had one of his elections, and it was very interesting. Well, I will say metrics are important, but they're not the big prize. The big prize is relationships, presence. Elisabeth brought up this concept that you have some relationship with vocational schools, that you're helping them and supporting them, that there's a presence there. I mean, you can also spend money on media campaigns and social networking efforts as well. But personal relationships are really important, and that's why it's a really long haul. The metrics are a component, or an accountability report. I didn't mean to say the accountability report is the answer, for example, to better relationships or people understanding what our universities do. But they're a very important little base component. There's something that shows, you care about that. So then to your question, Jacques, it's again constituencies. So the business community, what do they want to know? They want to know whether the students are, coming in are valuable, are they, trained to enter the labor market. There's a lot of criticism related to that, lots of misinformation as well. Often people look at liberal arts, social science majors, and they go, oh, well, those guys aren't doing any, they're not making money like engineers, so they don't have as big an impact. But if you actually look at them, they're really integrated in important parts of the world, and they're employed. There's all kinds of they're taxpayers, they're all those good things. So on the matrix, it's really, I think, more about constituencies. You can have a broad document and say it, but like the business community, labor, startups, patents, and how you're interacting with the economy. If you're then another constituency, which I think is really important, is your regional governments. How are you interacting with them? Do you have volunteer programs that help local schools? How are you outreaching to underrepresented minorities? And I will take Elisabeth's point. It is this is kind of as a way of thinking. One is, hey, we just don't have that many students at USP compared to the rest of where everybody else is going to the privates. These vocational education programs and other kinds of things. But it's not just your enrollment, it's how they're getting out into society. It's how other programs touch the lives of other people. Here's a thought that is built into the DNA, although I think it's been lost a little bit in the United States. But one of the goals of the University of California was to touch every citizen in the state of California in some way through the programs of the University of California. That doesn't mean just being enrolled, or being in extension courses. Extension courses, you're training lawyers, you're bringing back people, or people who've never had any experience with the university. You've got health programs that are touching the lives of people. And so I digressed a little bit on that, but I think constituencies is the way to think. Of course, you want a broad kind of way of talking about yourself, and that's why I was getting back to your mission statement, or how you portray yourself, and how important public engagement is part of that. And I'm sure you'll get some pushback from some of your faculty and all of that kind of thing, because they have different viewpoints. You know, it should be basic research. I shouldn't be doing anything that has anything to do with the market. So, but those constituencies are the one way I think to frame what kind of matrix you want to have. And matrix are no answer. They're just an important and valuable source of information that you should have, that's gathered in some coherent way and can be analyzed and used both internally for management as important as externally. One of the things that you asked me earlier on was what was the one thing, or like if there was one thing you could choose to try to improve public service engagement. I'm kind of separating that from the public relations, how you're relating to constituencies. But what could you do? And I get back to this, and I've said this before, it's providing an incentive system for faculty and students to some degree. But I think, you know, if you start with the faculty and you integrate it into hiring and advancement, as you say, it's a value that isn't done. And faculty will not, or just use simple economic behavioral economics and think a little bit about that in terms of the faculty. Now that's maybe a difficult thing to do. So, but I think that's one of the main things. The other thing I wanted to note was I thought it was great what Nina was saying about this course and program they did. You know what, there's a huge thirst for socially relevant coursework, including service learning, for students to get engaged. There are barriers. There's no structure for them often. I mean, I don't know enough about USP and the other institutions to make these claims, but I sense that there isn't many opportunities for them. For example, one of the biggest undergraduate minors we have at Berkeley is about social interaction. I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically, you know, getting out there into the community, and there's a curricular structure around it, on these kinds of things. So there's a huge thirst for these things. The other quick thing I wanted to say was, you know, I get back to my point about, well, what is it that you think your university should do? I gave you a long list. You could pick some of them or change the name or add to it. But what are the things that you really want to do? And that's kind of fundamental, I think, in terms of trying to think about what you're doing. And then if you're going to do matrix, you know the old term, you can't measure what you don't do. You know, you can't put a metrics up unless you've got to have a conceptual idea as to what you want to do. Then finally, I'll say is that, you know, I think the example that we've heard about the importance of the universities in Sao Paulo, and I presume within Brazil generally, in dealing with COVID, has generated, it appears, a larger understanding of the importance of the university systems or the universities themselves. And that's really a tremendous opportunity, that you should look at that as an opportunity to think about how to build on that. You know, healthcare is obviously so important, and the universities play a big role, in medical schools and otherwise. And related to that, I think, which we've talked about, Jacques, a bit, is that, you know, how can you leverage that and also think about a more united front among the major universities in Sao Paulo, and an alliance or something in which, you know, you're going to have to rest with the question of how much autonomy each institution has, how much ability, but what are the things you can do together to portray what you're doing to society, or lobby for your interests, hopefully that they're in the public interest. So that kind of alliance structure is something that could be very important too, that you build off of this goodwill off of the COVID pandemic. At least that's what I understand so far.